question. Have you ever watched your favorite artist get to this point in a painting and think to yourself, yo, that looks really easy, I could do that. But could you really? Hey guys, Tazik here, and right at this point in a painting, I think that I might actually be able to draw like my favorite artist. I mean, they made it look easy, a couple brush strokes here, some brush strokes there, but then they say they're gonna do a little bit more rendering. And then a minute goes by, and suddenly, they've created a masterpiece! Like, wait, how the crap did you do that? This is called the rendering stage. The part where many artists either get into the art zone or get lost painting endlessly for hours. I'm gonna break down what I think are the most important rendering lessons to learn so that none of you have to experience spending 6+ hours on a painting just for it to look like Gandhi's flip-flop. Okay, now obviously there are many different processes and ways artists like to go about their rendering stage. However, I think there is one that stands above all the others in terms of learning and fundamentals. And quite frankly, it's probably the simplest in theory. Isn't it crazy how so many aspects of art revolve around the concept of simplicity? To demonstrate, I'm going to paint from this foliage reference and we're going to focus on just this little square so it's a little easier for our puny brains to break down what I'm doing and thinking. I'll then paint the same square with a more texture focused rendering style, and then we can compare the final results after. Then I'm going to draw a full painting to demonstrate how I use both of the rendering styles together in an illustration. First, I need to actually get the base colors down before I do any rendering, so I'm just putting down the basic shapes I see. And since this is a fence, there are a lot of rectangular wooden planks, which makes getting the base shapes down pretty easy. For the leaves, I also use a lasso tool. If you look at how my hand moves during this, you'll think I'm tripping out. And while I am most of the time. The reason I'm doing this is because I want the leaves to look natural and organic, which I translate to be random. However, I'm still making sure that the end of the leaves are still falling downwards, so don't just feed the randomness, control the random. Taste the random. Finally, to get the netting, I took the default grid brush and sized it up hella, and then duplicated it, once for the outline and then again for the shadow. See, this is what happens when you actually expand your brain to digital painting. You just have so much more freedom to do whatever you want. Okay, now that we have our base down, let me show you the key elements of the first rendering style. It doesn't have an official name, so from now on I'm just gonna call it the basic round render. I know I said basic, but this style when mastered can produce incredible works. I'd consider Samdoesarts and Can Lu artists who've mastered the round render, and as you can see, their paintings are anything but basic. Okay, to render, all you need is a hard edge brush and a soft smudge tool. You can also use a soft airbrush, but if you really want to improve your understanding of form/rendering, I highly suggest you minimize your use of soft round brush, because when you only use a hard brush and blend tool, you build a better understanding of the planes of the object you are painting. Personally, I only ever use the airbrush when I need to do large sweeping gradients or overlay in some color. Other than that, hard round and smudge, baby. While I painted some colors and shadows on the foliage, let me quickly show you how to define form using this technique really quick. The hard round brush carries a hard edge, self-explanatory, but in real life everything does not contain a hard edge, which is why you need to use a smudge tool to blend and get that soft edge. But sometimes, you're gonna need a mix of edges, which is where you come back in with a hard edge brush and redefine a hard edge, while leaving another one soft. And guess what, that's basically all you need with any painting. Actually, executing that on a painting, however, isn't so easy. In this painting, I started out with just the base color, and then added some color variation. Then I added the shadows, and then I came back and softened the areas that I need to. I then add the highlights because those also define shape. Basically, I'm working from dark to light most of the time. This is a process I go with because that is how I think the brain processes images, or at least how I process images. There is a shape with the shadow, and since this part is facing away from the light, it slowly fades away. Then I think there is a light, and since this edge faces it directly, this is going to be the brightest spot. But as you can see, I still have some improving to do, as my strokes are not 100% confident, and I had to come back and redo parts over and over again. But still, practice makes perfect. Eventually. For the rest of this study, let me just quickly show you some tricks I used. I outlined the leaves because 1, a stylistic choice, but also 2, there's a top-down lighting from the sun, which means almost every leaf will have a hard shadow, and therefore, it gets an outline. If you're wondering about the brush I'm using right now, it's literally just a hard round brush, but just slightly squished down. One thing I like to do is add a lot of color into the shadows, so I added saturated oranges and blues. Personally, I think it just adds some nice flavor into the shadows. Here I duplicated the netting layer and created a mask so that I can experiment where I want the white highlights to be. Select the mask layer and use black to erase the parts you don't want, and use white to bring the parts you want back. I highly suggest you use a mask if you're uncertain about a certain portion of a painting. It is such an underused tool. Finally, I added some color dodge, and quick note, using color dodge in the shadow gives you the best effect. And there you have it, the final round render. I wouldn't call it my finest piece, but for the purposes of the study, I think it gets the job done. On to the textured rendering style. Now, it will still follow the same process as before: base color, color variation, shadows, soften them, and then highlights. Except this time, I can let the brush define the shapes for me. The difficulty that comes with the round render technique is that you don't get a lot of edge variation easily. You have to manually lower the brush size, go over strokes multiple times to achieve a good level of variation. With a textured brush, you can get slanted edges, mixed edges, soft edges all in one stroke. But that also means that the brush will prevent your brain from going through that image processing I told you about earlier. There's a shape with a shadow, and since this part is facing away from the light, it slowly fades away. With a textured brush, you lose that full knowledge of what your brush stroke is doing, and therefore you're just not learning as much. Obviously, as you become better with that brush, / better at painting in general, you learn to control your brush strokes better as well. But I think you'd have to train a lot with one singular brush to gain full control of that textured brush. Like, look over here, I lost some control on the edges here with the textured brush that I was using, and therefore this part looks a little bit less refined compared to the round render. And I've been using that brush since I was a wee little egglet. So if we look at the final result of our textured render, the overall look of it is very similar to the round render, but there's one key difference. I finished the round render in like an hour and 20 minutes, while the textured version took me just 35 minutes and 23 seconds. Now, I know it makes it sound like this textured rendering will solve all your art problems, but I completed the textured render that fast because I knew what I was doing. If I was a beginner, I'd have less control on how to use the texture brush, and I'd get in this loop of endless edits. Paint this there, do that, oops, looks like ass, undo, paint this there, and the cycle just goes on for way too long. With the round render, you focus on fundamentals, not the texture. With the round render, in a way, I've sort of tricked my brain into doing 45 minutes of extra learning. Okay, listen here, I'm about to drop some bars, some knowledge. Instead of aiming to paint faster, you should be aiming to make the correct decisions faster. Don't just put unconfident brushstrokes down for the sake of painting fast. Think about every stroke so that you don't have to paint as much. It's literally game-changing advice, bro. You're welcome. Okay, now that we're done with the study, let's implement those two styles into an actual painting. So in the study, I've shown you how I develop forms and stuff, but that's only one dimension of rendering. When you add textured rendering, there's also the element of how you use the brushes you have to create the effects you want. Let's look at how I take on a complex subject like these trees. Now, trees are very hard to do because there's a lot of small details in them. However, if we take a step back and realize that the distant trees are really not the main focus of painting, what those distant trees really become are just a bunch of jagged lines. So, I took this brush which paints a bunch of scratchy lines and basically did 3 brush strokes randomly, and I got the effect that I wanted. Then I took this brush and now I could produce snow blobs that sit on those branches with again like 3 brush strokes. I'm not thinking about if a snow clump has to be on this specific branch, but rather I'm only thinking there needs to be snow clumps on branches. More general and therefore a lot easier, you get me? Basically all that to say, not everything has to be fully rendered to every last shadow. Finally, there's one more thing I want to discuss about textured brushes. Shape-orientated brushes versus texture-orientated brushes. A shape-orientated brush, well, excels at defining shapes. They give you clean edges and cool shapes for free. However, in my experience, they lose a little bit of that texture to maintain an easy to control edge. A texture-orientated brush is for more texture. As the name suggests, they give you great textures, but these brushes are just no good when it comes to defining form and shapes. The edges are too loose and it's hard to control where you want your brushstrokes to be. So I use these brushes as a base underneath the painting or an overlay over the painting to show texture. If I tried to use this brush to block in the skin, I just want to die sooner. Speaking of skin, I've been talking about texture rendering for a long time, but portraits are where the round render really shines. Most of the body is smooth, so you could really focus on form and color with just your round render here, unless you're this guy. But yeah, there's just not that much texture to put in skin. I mostly add interest by adding in effects like saturated lines and some subtle color variations in the shadows, etc. We're getting near to the end of the painting, so I just want to take the time to give one last rendering advice. The colors / lighting / values you choose in the beginning of a painting are very important. Yes, before the rendering stage, before all of this. This is where many beginners will already doom themselves into rendering hell. You'll choke, fumble, goof, kerfuffle right here, before you've even started. You think to yourselves, okay, these colors look good enough, let me just start rendering now. Wrong! Starting out with okay colors is just not good enough, because later on you'll have to do a lot more color adjustment, and therefore you'll have a lot more opportunities to choose the wrong colors. For this skin tone, if I start out with a muddy color, and then I want to add a shadow here, guess what my shadow is going to be? It's going to be muddy. But let's say I notice that the shadow is too muddy, so then I increase the saturation on the shadow. Problem solved, right? No, because now the base skin looks off, and now I gotta readjust everything. Trust me, slow down and make sure the colors you selected are vibrant and work well together. If you start with good colors, you'll end off with good colors. Most of the time. Oh, and same goes for value. If your values are off in the beginning, they'll be horrible by the end. So please take that advice into your next painting. So there you have it, the final painting using both basic round render and textured render. Hopefully you learned a lot, and I tried to be as clear and concise with my tips, but please feel free to rewatch parts of the video and give me your precious watch time. Thank you. Alright, bye bye. I just want to say thank you to everyone who watched my last video. The support on it was actually insane. I never thought I'd be at a point where I'm struggling to read all the comments. It's like, it just hurts me. I can't reply out to you all. So again, just generally thank you. And hopefully some of y'all stick around for me and my art. I was just thinking about how this was sort of like my art reveal since my last video was a study. But also, just know that more studies are coming. Those take a little bit to do, so I beggeth, please wait. Next video will be a study for sure though. Okay, I guess this is where I kiss you on your forehead?